The sun hadn't risen yet when 3 enemy command posts went dark. No explosion, no warning, just silence where radio chatter had been. By the time commanders realized what was happening, it was already over. 94 soldiers surrounded inside a frozen mountain fortress. No food, no ammunition resupply, no hope of rescue arriving in time. Then a woman walked out of enemy lines, alone, carrying nothing but a rifle case and a name nobody recognized. She said 3 bullets were enough to save everyone. They laughed at her. They were wrong. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Stories like this one don't come around twice. Hit the like button, stay until the end, and let's begin. Colonel Ethan Mercer had done the math 3 times. He kept hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. He stood at the western parapet of Fort Raven with a field notebook open in his left hand and a pen that had stopped working sometime around midnight. The ink had frozen. He hadn't noticed until now because he'd stopped writing somewhere around the 3rd page, stopped when the numbers stopped making sense in any useful way. 94 soldiers, 41 hours of rations remaining if he cut portions by 30%. Ammunition, critical. 3 mortar rounds. Roughly 1,100 small arms rounds distributed unevenly across the garrison. 2 working radios with batteries that were dying faster than expected in the cold. No air support. The weather systems rolling down from the northern ridges had grounded everything with rotors for 2 days straight, and the meteorology report, delivered in a flat, apologetic voice by Corporal Hayes, suggested another 48 hours minimum before any aircraft could operate safely over Blackstone Pass. 48 hours. Mercer closed the notebook. He was a practical man. He'd been practical his entire career, 22 years of it, across 4 different theaters of conflict, 3 continents, and enough bad situations that he developed a kind of internal barometer for the difference between bad and finished. Some situations were recoverable. You bled, you adapted, you found the angle nobody else had seen, and you clawed your way through. Some situations were just finished. The math said so. Fort Raven looked finished. The outpost had been a forward operating base once, a real one, with resupply rotations and a medical team and a communications array that could reach division headquarters in under 4 seconds. That was 16 months ago. The strategic picture had shifted. Resources had been redirected. Fort Raven had been quietly downgraded from active forward position to maintained observation post, which in military language meant it was still on maps, but no longer on anybody's priority list. Then the enemy had moved, fast, coordinated, and in numbers that nobody's intelligence estimates had predicted. 3 militia groups, each operating independently in the region for years, had apparently decided to stop operating independently. They'd merged supply lines, consolidated command, and pushed hard into the mountain corridor with a speed that had left Fort Raven suddenly, terrifyingly surrounded before reinforcement orders had even been typed. That had been 73 hours ago. Since then, 2 failed breakout attempts, 11 wounded, 1 dead. Private Caruso, 19 years old, from somewhere outside of Tulsa, who had taken shrapnel across his throat during the 2nd night and hadn't survived the hour. Mercer had written the letter in his head. He hadn't been able to write it on paper because the pen was frozen, and also because he kept having to stop. He gripped the parapet stone with both hands and looked out across the valley. The enemy positions were visible in the pre-dawn gray. Not their bodies, but their fires, small and disciplined, dotted across the ridgelines in a rough horseshoe pattern that sealed every viable exit route. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. The cold and the hunger would do the work for them. All they had to do was wait. "Sir?" Sergeant First Class Nolan Briggs appeared at Mercer's shoulder with 2 tin cups. He held one out. Mercer took it without looking. Coffee, barely warm, tasting of metal and freeze-dried grounds that had been reused at least twice. Briggs was 41, built like a man who had been repeatedly broken and then reassembled by someone who cared more about function than aesthetics. His nose had been broken at least 3 times. There was a scar along his left jawline that he'd never explained to anyone's satisfaction. He had 17 years of service and the particular stillness of a man who had already made peace with a significant number of terrible outcomes. Anything on the eastern approach? Mercer asked. Negative. Kowalski ran the glass over the ridge for 2 hours. Nothing moving. Briggs paused. Nothing we'd want moving, anyway. Meaning? Meaning they've got it sealed tighter than the western corridor. If anything, they've added to it overnight. Kowalski counted 4 new positions since 2100. Mercer drank the coffee. It was bad, but it was warm, briefly, going down. Radio contact with division? Intermittent. Weather's chewing up the signal. Last solid contact was 6 hours ago. They confirm reinforcements are staged, but Briggs stopped and the pause itself carried weight. Weather hold is indefinite. They say anything else? They said hang tight. Mercer looked at him. Hang tight. Yes, sir. Hang tight. A long silence passed between them. Somewhere below in the inner courtyard of the fort, someone had started a small fire against regulations. Against regulations because smoke could give away position. But nobody had the heart to put it out because the temperature had dropped to something that stopped being survivable for wet clothing, and 3 soldiers had wet clothing after last night's drainage ditch collapsed. Mercer decided he couldn't see the fire from where he was standing. What are our options? He asked, though he already knew. This was less a question and more a ritual, the kind officers perform to prove to themselves they haven't stopped thinking. Briggs answered it seriously anyway, which was one of the reasons Mercer trusted him. Option 1. Sit and wait. We have 41 hours of rations at reduced portions. We might stretch it to 55 if we go to emergency minimums, but at that point we're looking at degraded combat effectiveness on top of everything else. He ticked off on his fingers. Option 2. Another breakout attempt. I'd put our chances at maybe 12%, and that's being optimistic about the western corridor. Option 3. Surrender and request POW status under convention protections. He stopped. Neither of them spoke for a moment. That last option is there, Mercer said carefully. It stays on the table, but it doesn't go on the table yet. Agreed. What's option 4? Briggs almost smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. We don't have an option 4, sir. Mercer nodded slowly. He set down the tin cup on the stone parapet. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that didn't just chill but pressed, like a physical weight on every surface of skin it could find. He pulled his collar up and stared out at the enemy fires. There's going to be a dawn attack, he said. Not a question. My read too. They've been probing our response patterns for 3 days. They know our rotation schedule. They know where our gaps are. Briggs glanced at the sky. Still dark, stars fading at the edges as some pre-dawn atmospheric shift began. Maybe 2 hours? Maybe less? All right, Mercer straightened. Get the section leaders. I want everyone at their positions in 90 minutes. Full brief at... The gate guard's voice cut through the cold from below, sharp and confused rather than alarmed. Sergeant Briggs, sir, we've got... A pause. Sir, we've got a situation at the front gate. Mercer took the stone steps 2 at a time, Briggs right behind him. The front gate of Fort Raven was a reinforced steel affair set into the original 19th century stone wall, an ugly marriage of old architecture and modern paranoia that had always struck Mercer as a decent metaphor for the entire outpost. Private Delgado was standing at the gate with his rifle up and his flashlight pointed through the narrow viewing slot, his posture communicating the specific tension of someone who has encountered something that wasn't in any briefing. Talk to me, Delgado. Single individuals, sir. Came in from the northern approach. On foot. Delgado glanced back at them, and his expression was genuinely puzzled. She knocked, sir. A beat. She knocked? Yes, sir. 3 times. Knocked on the gate like it was a front door. Mercer stepped up to the viewing slot. The figure standing outside the gate was a woman, alone, in cold-weather tactical clothing that had seen heavy use, the kind of use that showed in the texture of it, the way it sat on her body, patched at the left shoulder and dark with old stain at the right knee. She was medium height, lean in the way that came from years of sustained physical effort rather than any deliberate discipline, and she was standing with her hands slightly away from her sides in the universal posture of I am not drawing a weapon right now. She carried a rifle case. It was battered, hard-sided, black, the kind built for transport rather than display. Nothing else visible. No sidearm in evidence, though that didn't mean anything. She looked directly at the viewing slot. "I know you're looking at me," she said. Her voice was calm, not loud, pitched for the distance, carrying without straining. "My name is Claire Rowan. Brigadier General Vasiliev sent me. He said to tell you the password is Red Door, and that if Ethan Mercer is still in command, he needs to stop doing the math because the math was never going to work out, and he already knows that." Silence. Mercer stared through the slot. "Open the gate," he said. "Sir," Briggs started. "She just gave us a command-level authentication code from a retired general whose name isn't in any accessible personnel file, and she came in through the northern approach, which we have been watching for 3 days and which is currently the most surveilled avenue of approach this side of the valley." Mercer straightened. "Open the gate, Sergeant." "What?" "She came through without rushing, without looking around in the wide-eyed way that people entering a besieged position often did, cataloging damage and doing the math on survival odds. She looked at the gate mechanism as it closed behind her. She looked at Delgado's weapon, the angle of it, the trigger discipline. She looked at Mercer. "You're taller than I expected," she said. It didn't sound like a compliment or a criticism, just data she was filing. "You're not what I expected at all," Mercer said. "How'd you get through the northern corridor?" Carefully. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving right now." She shifted the rifle case slightly. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere you can look out over the whole valley while we talk, ideally. I want to walk you through the enemy positions, and I'd rather do it while I can show you. I'm going to need more than that before you go anywhere in this installation." Claire met his eyes. Hers were a dark gray-green, and they had the particular quality that Mercer had seen in certain people over the years. People who had been in enough bad situations that their baseline had shifted, that alarmed had been replaced as a resting state by something more like assessing. "Viktor Vasiliev," she said. "Retired, 8 months ago, lung cancer. He didn't tell anyone outside his circle, including you, which is why you don't know about it. He was my instructor for 4 years. He tracked your situation through back channels for the last 72 hours, and he called me in because he said you needed someone who could reach places that aircraft can't." She paused. "He also said you still owe him $40 from a poker game in 2019, and that you should stop carrying that frozen pen because it makes you look indecisive." Mercer looked at the pen in his breast pocket. He looked back at her. "Briggs," he said, "take her to the observation tower." The observation tower was the highest point in Fort Raven, a repurposed stone structure from the outpost's original construction that had been fitted with modern equipment and then had most of that equipment damaged or destroyed during the first night of the siege. What remained was a cold stone room at the top of a narrow stair with narrow windows facing all 4 cardinal directions, and crucially, an unobstructed view of the entire valley bowl and surrounding ridgelines. Mercer had ordered his section leaders to meet them there. He wanted witnesses. They arrived within 5 minutes. Lieutenant Park, 28, sharp and careful. Sergeant First Class Chen, 43, who had forgotten more about tactical positioning than most people ever learned. Corporal Vasquez, field promoted after their original communications specialist, had been wounded in the first breakout attempt. And Private First Class Osei, who was there because Mercer trusted his instincts, and because sometimes the most valuable perspective in a room belonged to the person with the least rank, and therefore the least to protect. Claire Rowan stood at the northern window with the pre-dawn light beginning to thin the dark outside and looked at the valley for approximately 45 seconds without speaking. She hadn't opened the rifle case. She hadn't asked for maps, though they'd been laid out on the central table. Then she started talking. Eastern Ridge Line. The primary command element is positioned at the 3rd finger from the north. You can identify it by the radio antenna mounted to a natural rock formation that looks like a seated figure from this angle. They've been rotating personnel every 4 hours, which means the current shift took over at approximately 0200, and they'll be most fatigued around 0430. Briggs looked at the table map. He looked out the window. He looked at Mercer. "The secondary command post," Claire continued, "is in the ravine below the southern ridge, actually inside the ravine, which is why your observation hasn't picked it up, because the line of sight from this tower is blocked by the ridgeline overhang. They're running a relay antenna up to the southern boulder field. Take out the relay and the secondary post goes deaf." How do you— Park started. The Western Corridor force is divided into two elements, she continued, not stopping. The larger element, approximately 60 fighters, is positioned here. She pointed to a section of the window, not the map. The map wasn't the reference she was using. The smaller element, about 20, is held back in reserve along the logging road. They haven't moved in 36 hours because they're the exploitation force. They come in after the main assault creates the breach. She turned from the window. The assault is scheduled for 0530, not dawn generally. Specifically 0530 because their field commander did a time motion analysis and determined that your defenders will be at peak fatigue between 0515 and 0545 based on your rotation patterns. Complete silence. How long were you out there? Briggs asked. Long enough. He stopped himself, started again. That's not a short recon. The northern approach— I came in 3 days ago, Claire said simply. I've been watching. Chen exhaled slowly. He looked at the window, then at the map, then at Claire. You were in their lines. I was in the valley. I moved when they weren't watching, which was more often than you'd think. People watching a fixed position from fixed positions stop paying attention to their own flanks after about 48 hours. It's a universal constant. She pulled a small notebook from her chest pocket, analog, handwritten, dense with notation, and set it on the table. Frequencies, rotation times, call signs, individual commander vocal patterns on the radio, position depths, sight lines from each position to this tower. This is everything. Park leaned forward and looked at the notebook. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Why didn't you just— He started, then stopped. Give it to command? Claire looked at him. I did. I flagged the merger of these 3 groups 6 weeks ago. The report exists. Somewhere. A pause that said everything about what she thought of that. General Vasiliev called me when he saw you were encircled. I came. You came through enemy lines, Vasquez said slowly, with a rifle case, and spent 3 days collecting intelligence and then knocked on our gate. The knocking was a judgment call, Claire said. I didn't want anyone to accidentally shoot me. You said 3 bullets, Mercer said. He'd been quiet through most of it. He'd let the section leaders ask their questions while he stood at the western window and looked at the enemy fires and thought. Now everyone else was quiet and looking at him, and he was looking at Claire Rowan. 3 match-grade rounds, she confirmed. She touched the rifle case without opening it. Not 3 shots at individual fighters, 3 shots at the command architecture. Take out the communication nodes and the field commander and you don't have a coordinated assault. You have 400 people who suddenly don't know what the others are doing. They're merged, but they've been independent for years. The coordination is imposed from the top. Remove the top, and the seams come apart. A coordinated attack on command elements? Chen began. Decapitation strike, Park said. He was frowning. Not a dismissive frown, a thinking one. It's theoretically sound. The problem is execution. To hit 3 separate targets at those ranges at dawn in mountain wind— I know the problem, Claire said. The probability of success under those conditions is— I know the probability. Park stopped. What do you need? Mercer asked. A firing position at the top of this structure, the highest point available. She looked at the ceiling. I assume there's something above this room? Maintenance platform, open air. That works. I need a 40-minute setup window starting at 0445. She paused. And I need you to keep everyone off the radio from 0445 until I indicate the sequence is complete. Every frequency. Total silence. I'll explain why later. Why later? Because if I explain it now, we'll spend 20 minutes arguing about it, and I'd rather use those 20 minutes differently. She looked around the room. Any other questions about the plan? Briggs raised his hand slightly. It was such an uncharacteristically formal gesture from him that Osei almost laughed. What if something goes wrong? Define wrong. Any of the shots miss. The enemy adapts faster than expected. You get compromised. Claire seemed to consider this genuinely, not as a deflection. If the first shot misses, we're in the same position we're in now, minus 40 minutes. If the second shot misses, We've got partial disruption, but probably not enough. If the third shot misses, she stopped. The third shot won't miss. It's the only answer I have, she said. Not harshly, just plainly. I can show you the trajectory calculations. I can show you the atmospheric modeling I ran based on 3 days of wind observation. I can show you the zero data on this rifle going back 2 years. She put her hand flat on the table. But at some point you're asking me to promise you something nobody can promise, and I'd rather be honest about that than give you a number that makes you feel better. Silence. Osei spoke up. He hadn't said anything yet. Why are you doing this? Everyone looked at him. He was 23 years old and had the slightly apologetic bearing of someone who constantly suspected he was in the wrong meeting. I mean, what's in it for you? He looked at Claire directly. You could have walked away. You had the intelligence. You could have gone back over the ridge and handed it off and stayed safe. Why come in? Claire looked at him for a moment. The general asked me to, she said. It wasn't the whole answer. Everyone in the room could hear that, but it was the answer she gave and something in the way she gave it, the slight tightening at the jaw, the way her eyes moved briefly to something that wasn't in the room, closed the topic like a door swinging shut. 0445, Mercer said. You get your window. Between 0200 and 0445, the fort prepared. Not for rescue. That hope was still too fragile to lean on. For survival. Section leaders redistributed the remaining ammunition according to Claire's intelligence, repositioning defenders to cover the specific breach points she'd identified. The western wall's southeastern corner, previously considered a secondary concern, turned out to be the planned entry point for the enemy's main assault force, and Briggs personally oversaw the repositioning of their remaining automatic weapons to cover it. Claire spent 40 minutes with Vasquez going through the enemy radio frequencies she'd documented, walking him through the pattern logic so that someone other than her would understand what they were hearing and when silence meant what. Then she disappeared into a corner of the ground floor with the rifle case and didn't come out for an hour. When she did come out, she was carrying the rifle. Mercer had seen a lot of weapons in his career. This one was distinctive. A bolt action, custom-built on a platform he recognized but extensively modified, with a suppressor that was integrated rather than attached, and a stock that had been adjusted and readjusted and adjusted again over what looked like years of use. The scope was enormous and high quality. The whole system looked like it had been worked on continuously, like a musician's instrument, not clean exactly, but cared for in a way that was different from clean. She carried it easily, which said something about how long she'd been carrying it. You should sleep, Briggs told her. He'd appeared from somewhere with another cup of terrible coffee. I'm fine. You've been awake for Sergeant. She took the coffee. I'm fine. He studied her for a moment. You been to Blackstone before? No. General Vasiliev mentioned Fort Raven specifically. He mentioned Colonel Mercer specifically. He said, she stopped, reconsidered. He said Mercer was the kind of officer who'd still be looking for an angle when everyone else had stopped looking. He said that was worth trying to help. She drank the coffee without making a face, which, given the coffee's quality, was its own kind of data point. He also said the $40 was a joke, and Mercer's been carrying that guilt for 4 years for no reason. Briggs almost smiled. What else did he say? He said this situation was solvable. A pause. He was very certain about that, more certain than I was, honestly. She looked at the rifle in her hands. Victor tends to see the solution before anyone else does. He's been doing it for 40 years. It's almost irritating. Tends to? She was quiet for a moment. He's sick, she said. That was all she said about it. Briggs nodded slowly. He didn't push. You trained under him long? 4 years, formally. Then, you know how it is. You don't really stop training under someone, even after the official part is done. They're just there, in your head, telling you things at inconvenient moments. She looked out the narrow window at the thinning dark. He'll be listening to this on a sat feed. He has contacts who can pull the signal. He likes to... She stopped again. He likes to know how things turn out. And how does this turn out? Claire looked at him. In the dim light of the fort's interior, her expression was unreadable in the specific way that came from practice. "You should reposition the fire team at the northeastern corner," she said. "The angle's wrong for what's coming." Briggs looked at her for another second. Then he nodded and went to find the fire team. At 0443, Claire climbed to the maintenance platform. The platform was barely large enough to count as such. A 3-meter square of reinforced planking bolted to the top of the stone tower, originally installed for antenna maintenance, with a low retaining wall on 3 sides and open to the south. There was no concealment worth mentioning. Anyone with optics on the ridgelines could potentially see the platform's outline. Claire had accounted for this. She'd spent 20 minutes rigging the low wall with a ghillie cover improvised from the equipment stores that changed the platform's silhouette without restricting her movement, and she'd identified the specific angular relationships between her position and each enemy observation post. The physics of observation. If you couldn't see them, they likely couldn't see you, but the math was trickier than it sounded because of elevation differentials and the curvature of terrain features. She had done the math multiple times. The cold at the top of the tower was savage. The wind, which had been moderate at ground level, became something else entirely up here. Not steady, but variable, gusting and dying in patterns that had nothing to do with the visible world below. Mountain air had its own logic. You couldn't predict it from ground observation. You had to feel it, watch it, let the pattern develop in your body until you could almost feel the next gust before it arrived. She had been reading this wind for 3 days from the valley floor. Now she lay behind the rifle and let her breathing slow and watched the world below begin to organize itself out of darkness. At 0451, she keyed the radio twice. The double click that meant, "I'm in position." From below, Mercer's voice came back. "Copy. All stations, radio silence begins now." The valley went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 3 days. Claire put her eye to the scope. The first target was the command antenna on the eastern ridge. Not the personnel at the position, not yet, but the relay equipment that was carrying signal between the primary and secondary command elements. A mechanical target. Small, partially concealed, at a range of 940 meters. She had the bullet weight, the powder charge, the ballistic coefficient of the projectile, the elevation, the expected wind. She had 3 days of observational data. She had 2 years of zero history on this rifle. What she also had, and this was the part that nobody's calculations could fully account for, was the specific, indefinite thing that made some people able to do this and most people unable to. The ability to be completely still inside while the world outside was anything but. The ability to commit, to let the moment arrive and not reach for it, not hurry it, not flinch away from it. Victor had tried to name it once. He'd called it patience with consequences. He'd then said that was a terrible name for it, but he couldn't think of a better one. She watched the wind flags she'd installed, small strips of survey tape tied to the retaining wall at 3 different heights. And she breathed, and she waited. At 0458, the wind did what she'd predicted it would do at 0458. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was not silent. No shot was silent. That was a movie convention she had never had patience for. But it was significantly quieter than an unsuppressed report, muffled to a sharp crack thud that in the ambient sounds of a mountain morning could be mistaken for a dozen other things. Below, at 940 meters, the relay antenna ceased to function. 2 seconds of silence in the valley. Then the enemy radio network erupted. She could hear the chaos through Vasquez's handset down below. Different voices, different frequencies, the specific texture of confusion spreading through a communications system that had just lost a critical node. Controllers trying to reach the secondary post. The secondary post not responding. Backup protocols activating. People asking questions that weren't getting answered. She was already shifting her position 6 degrees. The second target was a person, the communications officer at the primary command element on the eastern ridge. Not the field commander. She wasn't done with the commander yet. The communications officer, because losing the relay antenna would prompt them to try manual backup procedures, and the communications officer would be the person activating those procedures. And without a communications officer and without the relay, the 2 command elements would be effectively isolated from each other for a minimum of 12 to 18 minutes while they scrambled. 12 to 18 minutes was enough. The range was longer, 1,120 meters. The angle was different. The wind had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to account for, and mountain wind shifts had their own personality, their own rhythm, and she had been listening to this particular wind for 3 days. The second shot was harder. She knew it before she squeezed the trigger. She squeezed the trigger anyway. Below, across the valley, something changed at the primary command element. She couldn't confirm the result from here. Distance, dawn light, the limitations of even an excellent scope. But the radio chatter shifted again, acquired a new kind of panic, the specific tenor of people who had just lost someone important in real time. She shifted again. The third position. The third round. And here she stopped, because the third round was for the field commander, and the field commander was not at his position. She scanned, east to west, systematic, not rushing. Rushing was how you missed things at distance, how you convinced yourself you were seeing what you expected to see rather than what was actually there. He wasn't on the eastern ridge. He wasn't at the secondary post location. He was a sound from somewhere below the platform. Not from the fort, from outside the fort. To the north, which was wrong, which was the direction she'd come in from, which was... The first burst of automatic fire hit the maintenance platform wall 2 seconds later. The retaining wall took most of it. Claire rolled right by reflex, not thought. Right was the correct direction because right was the lowest exposure angle. Right was the only move that made sense in the half-second of available time. And the ghillie rig she'd built absorbed 2 rounds meant for her spine, and she ended up pressed against the east-facing wall of the platform with her left shoulder on fire, and the rifle still in her hand somehow, because you did not drop the rifle. Blood, already. Left shoulder. She could feel the specific heat of it, the way it spread differently from impact pain, warm where it shouldn't be warm. Somewhere below the tower, she could hear boots on stone stairs. She looked at the rifle in her hands, third round, still chambered. Third target, not yet found. Below her, the field commander was somewhere, and the assault clock was still running, and somewhere in a hospital room an old man was listening to a satellite feed trying to find out how this turned out. She pressed her back against the wall and listened to the boots getting closer. The third round had to count. She just had to survive long enough to fire it. The maintenance platform was exposed on 3 sides. The blood wouldn't stop. The boots were 20 seconds away. And somewhere in the valley below, a field commander was waiting for his assault to begin. A man who had specifically accounted for the possibility of a sniper, who had planned a counter, and who had executed that counter with exactly the kind of speed and decisiveness that made him more dangerous than anything else out there. Claire Rowan pressed the rifle to her chest, controlled her breathing through pain that was trying very hard to stop her from thinking clearly, and started working out the geometry of the only play she had left. The boots hit the top step. Mercer came through the platform hatch first, moving fast and low, Briggs right behind him with his rifle up and sweeping. Both of them expecting to find Claire dead or gone or compromised, because that was what the gunfire had suggested, and the gunfire had been close and sustained, and that was never a good combination at the top of a stone tower in a besieged fort. What they found instead was Claire Rowan sitting with her back against the east wall, her left hand pressed flat against her shoulder, and her right hand holding the rifle across her lap with a steadiness that had no business existing given the amount of blood soaking through her jacket. "Contact north side," she said, as if reporting a weather condition. "Single shooter, suppressed. He was already positioned when I took the first shot. Pre-planned." Her jaw tightened, said, "Not from pain, or not only from pain. They knew someone would be up here." Mercer crossed the platform in 4 steps and dropped to a knee beside her. He pulled her hand away from the shoulder long enough to look. Entry wound, high and lateral. Bad placement for a lot of things. Survivable for most of them if it stayed clean and if she didn't bleed out, both of which were conditional on factors that hadn't been resolved yet. "Medic," he said into his radio. "Don't," Claire said. "You're bleeding." "I know I'm bleeding. Don't pull anyone off the walls. Not now." She put her hand back against the wound and pressed. "The third shot." "I haven't taken the third shot." "You can barely hold the rifle." "I'm holding it fine." "Claire, where is he?" She looked at Mercer directly, and whatever was behind her eyes wasn't pain, or it was pain transformed into something that functioned differently, something that narrowed rather than scattered. "The field commander. He moved before I could get the shot. That's why they had someone up here. Not to stop me from shooting, but to stop me from shooting him specifically. He knew he was the third target. Briggs had moved to the south-facing wall and was scanning with his binos. How would he know that? Because it's what he would do. If he knew there was a sniper and he knew his communications were going to be hit, he would reason forward, after the comm nodes, the commander. So he moved. She exhaled carefully, managing the pain the way you manage difficult terrain. One step at a time, don't look at the whole distance. Where did he go? I can't. Briggs stopped. The binos stayed at his eyes. Wait. Silence. Western slope, near the logging road. He adjusted the angle slightly. There's a vehicle, covered. Wasn't there an hour ago? That's him. She started to push herself upright. Absolutely not, Mercer said. Colonel, you cannot shoot 1,100 meters with a shoulder wound at this angle. He put a hand on her good arm, not hard but definite. The physics don't work. The physics work fine if the human physics don't work. His voice was flat and certain. Your right arm is compensating for the left. Your breathing is off. The natural point of aim has shifted because your body has shifted. You know all of this. A pause. You know all of this better than I do. She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong, which was a particular kind of frustrating that she had limited patience for under normal circumstances and zero patience for right now. The rifle in her hands felt the same as it always felt, familiar, calibrated, an extension of something. But her body underneath the rifle was not the same. The shoulder was sending signals that her brain was trying to filter out, and mostly succeeding at filtering out. But mostly was not completely. And at 1,100 meters in mountain wind, mostly was not sufficient. Then we have a problem, she said. Because without the third shot, you've got partial disruption. Maybe 40 minutes before they reestablish comm protocols and get the assault back on schedule. Maybe less if the field commander is good, and he is good. Good enough to plan a counter-sniper response in real time, which means he's been doing this a long time. We use the 40 minutes, Briggs said from the wall. He'd lowered the binos. Push everyone to the breach points you identified. Make them fight for every inch. You'll lose people. We're going to lose people regardless. You'll lose more people. She looked at the rifle, back at Mercer. I need a different position, lower angle, compensating for the arm. If I'm shooting from... She worked the geometry in her head, running it against the map she'd built over 3 days of observation. The eastern parapet, the third section from the gate. There's a natural notch in the stonework at shoulder height on a prone shooter. The angle to the western slope from there is exposed, Briggs said. That section of wall lost its overhead cover in the second breakout. Anyone on that parapet is visible to the southern ridgeline. I know. They'll shoot at you. They've been shooting at me. I'm still here. She met his eyes. Something moved through her expression. Not recklessness, which was the easy read, but something more deliberate. Something that had been decided about some time ago and wasn't being decided now. I need someone to get me to that position, and I need 2 minutes. Park's voice came through the radio before anyone could respond. He was at the eastern wall. Sir, we've got movement on the ridgeline. They're repositioning. Looks like, sir, the reserve element on the logging road is moving up. How many? All of them, 20 plus. They're not waiting for the main assault. Mercer looked at Claire. She looked back at him. The field commander is accelerating the timeline, she said. He knows his comm network is damaged. He's pushing the assault before the disruption spreads to the main element. She got to her feet. The movement cost her something. Visible in the way the color shifted in her face, a brief compression of the lips, but she was upright. Mercer, I need the eastern parapet. He looked at her for 2 seconds that contained a significant amount of calculation. Briggs, he said, go with her. Briggs looked at the blood soaking through her jacket. He looked at Mercer. He looked back at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not fully resolve, not fully resignation, something in between that had the quality of a man who had decided to trust something he couldn't completely verify. Copy that, he said. The eastern parapet was 60 meters and 2 flights of stairs from the tower base, which under normal circumstances was nothing, and under these circumstances was a significant distance that Briggs covered at a controlled run with Claire beside him at a pace that matched his own, which told him something about how much she'd decided not to show. The fort was fully awake now, every defender at their position. The sound of the enemy reserve element advancing up the logging road was audible from the walls. Not gunfire yet, but movement, the texture of a force that wasn't bothering to conceal its approach because it had decided concealment was no longer the priority. 63 seconds from the tower to the eastern parapet. The third section of wall was identifiable by the absence of overhead cover, a 4-meter stretch where a mortar round had removed the wooden canopy structure on day one, leaving the parapet open to the sky and to the sight lines of the southern ridgeline. The natural notch Claire had identified was real, a gap in the stonework approximately 40 centimeters wide, at a height that would work for a prone shooter positioned behind it, angling southwest toward the western slope where the field commander's vehicle had been spotted. The range from here was different, longer on this axis. She was adding distance by moving east, which the geometry made necessary, and the total came to approximately 1,230 meters on the angle she needed, longer than she'd planned. She didn't say that. She found the notch and went flat behind it in one movement, the rifle coming up as she settled, her left arm positioned so that the wounded shoulder was bearing as little weight as possible, and her right arm and cheek and breathing were doing everything that needed doing. The pain was a fact. It was not a relevant fact. She had made that determination on the stairs, and she was enforcing it now. "Southern ridgeline," Briggs said from behind her. He'd taken a position against the inner wall, angled so he could watch without exposing himself. "They'll see you when you shoot. The muzzle signature even suppressed. I know. You get one shot before they have your position dialed. That's how many I have left." He was quiet. In the scope, the western slope, the covered vehicle. Movement near it. Figures, 2 of them, and then between them a third taller, standing at a particular angle that communicated command in the way that command communicated itself when people weren't trying to hide it, which this man was not, because he believed he was out of range and out of view. He was out of view. He was not out of range. At 1,230 meters, in mountain wind, with a compromised shooting position and a left shoulder that was trying to distract her from the math she needed to do, the margin for error was a number she would have found uncomfortable in optimal conditions. She let her breathing slow. Watch the wind flags she could still see from this angle. 2 of the 3 original strips of tape, visible from the parapet if she knew where to look, which she did because she had placed them. The wind was doing the thing it did every morning at this hour in this valley. She had watched it for 3 days. It was predictable in its unpredictability, gusting in a pattern that repeated with enough regularity that you could wait for the specific 30-second window when it dropped to a consistent baseline before the next sequence began. She watched the flags. She held the breath. Briggs behind her said absolutely nothing. Whatever he thought about the odds right now, he understood that silence was what was needed, and he provided it. The flags dropped. Her finger had already begun its movement before the conscious decision caught up to it. That was how this worked when it worked right. The body ahead of the mind, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of repetitions arriving at the answer before the thinking part got there. You trained until thinking wasn't part of it anymore. You trained until it was just you and the problem and the solution and the distance between them. The rifle fired. The sound of it was swallowed immediately by everything else, by the wind, by the advancing noise of the reserve element to the north, by a burst of fire that opened up from somewhere on the southern ridgeline approximately 4 seconds after the shot, which was 4 seconds too late. Briggs grabbed her by the good arm and pulled hard because the incoming fire from the southern ridgeline was working across the parapet in a way that meant staying was not an option, and she let herself be pulled because she had done what she came to do or she hadn't, and there was no version of reality in which taking more rounds improved the situation. They ended up behind the inner wall, flat, with stone chips raining down on them from rounds striking the parapet above. "Did you?" Briggs started. "I don't know yet." "How do you not?" 1,200 meters. "I won't know for—" She stopped. From the radio on Briggs' vest, Vasquez's voice came through, controlled but with an edge underneath it that hadn't been there before. "All stations, be advised. Enemy radio net has gone completely dark. Repeat, All enemy frequencies silent. Reserve element advance has stopped. I say again, reserve element has stopped moving. A pause. Western slope. I've got a visual on the command vehicle. It's not moving. There are people around it, but they are not. They appear to be. Another pause. Sir, I think the command element is down. Briggs looked at Claire. She had her eyes closed. Her hand was back against the shoulder, blood on the stone beneath her. Hey, he said. She opened her eyes. Nice shot, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Don't. Don't what? That thing where people say nice shot and then want to talk about it. He almost smiled. I wasn't going to talk about it. Everyone always wants to talk about it. I was going to talk about getting a medic to your shoulder before you pass out. I'm not going to pass out. You've lost a significant amount of blood. I'm aware. But she didn't argue when he keyed the radio and called for Peterson, who was the closest thing they had to a medical specialist. She leaned back against the inner wall and looked at the sky above the fort. Lightening now, genuinely lightening, the gray becoming something with color in it, the mountains to the east beginning to acquire edges again as dawn moved in from wherever dawn came from. 3 shots. 3 rounds. She thought about the third one and what she'd said about it in the tower. The third shot won't miss. And she thought about how that was either the truest thing she'd said all night or the most reckless, and at 1,230 meters she still wasn't completely certain which. The radio confirmed it 11 seconds later, when Park's voice came through to report that the reserve element was turning back, not retreating in order but dispersing, fragmenting into the kind of uncoordinated movement that happened when a military unit lost not just its commander, but its certainty. Briggs let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding since the shot fired. How long? He asked. She knew what he meant. Depends on who steps up. If they have a competent second, an hour, maybe 90 minutes. If the second is fighting with whoever's running the eastern element over who's actually in charge now, could be longer. She shifted slightly against the wall and did not respond to what that cost her. It's not over. You need to be clear about that. The disruption gives you time, but time has to be used. Mercer's already pushing it. Good. Peterson arrived at a low run, kit in hand, and took one look at Claire's shoulder and said several things under his breath that indicated a medical opinion before he'd even touched her. I need to look at this, he said. Look fast. I need to... Fast, Peterson. Her voice was quiet, but it had weight. The situation is not over. He looked at her. He looked at Briggs. Briggs gave him nothing useful, and he clearly knew it, so he opened his kit and started working with the efficiency of someone who understood that arguing about time with this particular patient was not going to improve the time situation. The wound was through and through. The bullet had entered the rear of the shoulder and exited near the clavicle, which was a trajectory that had missed the major vessels by a margin that Peterson found meaningful enough to say so, aloud, to nobody in particular. You're lucky, he said. People keep saying that, Claire said. It's true. It's a perspective. She watched him work. Pack it and tape it. I can't have a sling. I need to be able to move my right arm freely. Left arm isn't going to be doing anything useful for a while regardless. She looked at him until he looked back at her. Pack it and tape it. He packed it and taped it. His expression communicated clearly that he disagreed with this approach and that he understood his disagreement was not changing anything. From below, from the interior of the fort, the sound of the garrison had changed. Not celebration, nothing as fragile or premature as that, but the texture of people who had been in a specific kind of suspended dread for 3 days and had felt something release slightly, insufficiently, but release. Movement with slightly different energy. Voices that had stopped talking about the minimum necessary and started talking about adjacent topics. Not optimism, not yet, but the first symptom of it. Mercer came through the interior door of the parapet at a walk. He looked at Claire against the wall. He looked at Peterson finishing the packing. He looked at the blood on the stone. Asset is intact, Briggs said, which was a strange way to describe a person, and was therefore completely characteristic of Briggs. Reserve element is retreating, Mercer said. Eastern Ridge is going quiet.
We've got maybe 90 minutes before they consolidate under new command.
That's what I estimated, Claire said. What do you need? He asked. She blinked. It was not the question she had expected exactly. Or rather, it was the question she'd expected, framed in a way she hadn't. What do you need rather than what do we do next? Can you get division on the radio? Solid contact? Vasquez has been trying. Weather's marginally better. We might get through. Tell them the field commander is down and the assault timeline has collapsed. Tell them the window is 90 minutes, if they have any assets that can move in that window. She stopped. Tell them it's possible, that it's actually possible now. Mercer looked at her for a moment. 3 days ago, he said, when Vasiliev called you, what did he actually say? She was quiet. He said you needed an option 4, she said finally. And he said I was it. A pause that wasn't comfortable and didn't try to be. He also said you'd fight me on it. He was right about that too. I didn't fight you. You made Briggs stand in the room with me every time I was somewhere exposed. Briggs from the wall. That was my own initiative. Was it? He said nothing. Claire almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. It arrived and departed in the space of about a second, leaving her expression exactly where it had been. Vasquez, Mercer said into his radio, get me division, whatever it takes. The radio crackled. Vasquez's voice came back with interference at the edges, but clear enough. Sir, I've got a partial signal. It's not great, but static. I've got someone. Stand by. A different voice through the static, distant and fractured, but present. Fort Raven, this is forward command. Authenticate. Mercer read the authentication. His voice was steady. The voice came back. Fort Raven, what is your status? We have a window, Mercer said. 90 minutes. We need everything you can move. A pause on the other end. Then, copy that, Fort Raven. Stand by for coordination. Briggs exhaled for the second time since sunrise. Claire looked at the sky. The color in it had developed. Pale gold at the eastern edges, the mountains coming into full definition now, the valley below beginning to show its actual self, rather than the assumed geography of darkness. It was not a beautiful morning. It was a cold morning, a hard morning, with ice on the rocks and blood on the parapet stones and 94 people inside the walls who needed the next 90 minutes to hold. But it was a morning that existed. She settled back against the wall, managed the shoulder, and listened to Mercer work the radio with the particular intensity of a man who had found his option 4 and was not going to let go of it. From somewhere in the valley, as the light grew, came the sound of the enemy's fractured communications, confused signals, overlapping voices, the organizational noise of a force that had lost its center and hadn't yet found a new one. It was a specific sound. She had heard it before. It meant the next move was anyone's. She checked the rifle. One thing she had learned over the years, over the missions, over the impossible shots at impossible distances and impossible conditions. The window between disruption and reorganization was real, but it was not generous. Forces adapted, commands restructured. Someone always stepped up, because someone always did, because that was the nature of the people who ended up in positions like this one, on both sides of the wall. Whatever came through that window in the next 90 minutes, she wanted to be ready for it. The shoulder throbbed. She breathed through it. Peterson's tape held. Outside the fort, the valley waited. The 90 minutes did not hold. It collapsed at 63. Vasquez called it first, his voice tight over the radio. Sir, Eastern Ridgeline is reorganizing. I've got new antenna activity at the second finger. They've shifted position, new relay setup, and the western element, a pause that lasted too long. The western element is moving again, different formation, tighter, more disciplined. Mercer was already moving toward the eastern parapet when the first mortar round came in. It landed in the outer courtyard. Not a direct hit on anything critical, but close enough that the shockwave traveled through the stone and up through everyone's feet, and the sound of it was the specific sound that ended the brief, fragile period of near optimism that had been building since the third shot. One mortar round was a ranging shot. The second would be an adjustment. The third would be trying to hit something specific. They found a second commander, Claire said. She was already up, off the wall, moving, not running, because running with a packed shoulder wound was an invitation to tear something Peterson had carefully reapproximated, but moving fast enough that Briggs had to extend his stride to stay with her. They went through the interior door and down toward the main observation point where Mercer had established his command position. And by the time they got there, the radio traffic had multiplied into the kind of density that meant multiple things happening at once from multiple directions. Park's voice. Western wall contact, small arms, sustained. Chen's voice. Eastern approach has movement, estimate 30 plus. And underneath both of them, the specific thump of a second mortar round, this one closer, and the sound of something structural deciding it had absorbed enough. Mercer was at the table with the map and the radio handset, processing it all with the particular stillness of a man who had reached the point where panic was no longer an available response because the situation had moved too fast for it. He looked up when Claire came through the door. "They reorganize faster than you estimated," he said. Not an accusation, just a data point. "Yes." She looked at the map. The enemy's new positions, as Vasquez was calling them in, were different from the original layout, faster, more opportunistic, taking advantage of the gap left by the field commander's death and filling it not with a single replacement but with distributed initiative, multiple subcommanders each pushing their own element without waiting for centralized coordination. It was in a functional sense a harder problem than the original one. Centralized command was vulnerable to decapitation. Distributed command was not. Radio contact with forward command? Intermittent. They have assets moving, but Mercer looked at the handset. ETA is uncertain. Weather is still a factor on the air assets. Ground element is... He stopped. Ground element is an hour out minimum. So we hold for an hour. We hold for an hour with ammunition for maybe 40 minutes of sustained contact. Silence. From somewhere on the western wall came the sustained rattle of their remaining automatic weapon, short controlled bursts. Chen's discipline, keeping the rate of fire inside what the ammunition count could support. Buying minutes with mathematics. Options, Mercer said. Claire looked at the map. She had spent 3 days reading this valley. She knew the shape of it in a way that no map fully communicated. The actual terrain, the places where the map's representation diverged from reality, the microtopography that mattered at ground level and was invisible on paper. She looked at the enemy's new positions as Vasquez updated them, watched the pattern develop. "They're trying to find a new center," she said. "The subcommanders are each pushing because none of them wants to be the one who held back while the others advanced. It's a race, not a coordinated assault, which means there are gaps." She pointed to the map. The space between the western element and the eastern element, a corridor along the northern drainage that both groups were ignoring because both groups were oriented toward the fort rather than toward each other. "There. That's where you came in," Briggs said. "That's where I came in. It was a gap 3 days ago when I used it, and it's still a gap because neither of the subcommanders knows about it. It was the field commander's blind spot, and they've inherited his observation setup without his analysis." She looked at Mercer. "If you need to move people, that's your corridor. I'm not evacuating 94... Not evacuating. Repositioning. A small element out and around, coming up from the north on the western element's flank. 15 minutes of movement. If they hit that element from the flank while Chen is holding the wall, the western push collapses and you free up the garrison to concentrate on the east." Mercer looked at the map, looked at her. "Who leads the flanking element?" "Someone who knows the ground." A pause. "Or someone who can follow instructions precisely and quickly." "That's Briggs," Mercer said, and the decision was already in his voice before the sentence finished. Briggs didn't react. "How many?" 6, fast and light, no heavy weapons. You won't need them, you need surprise." Claire walked to the window that faced north and looked out for 10 seconds, verifying what she remembered against what she could currently see. The drainage corridor was there. The enemy's attention was elsewhere. "You come out through the drainage gate on the north wall. I'll mark the waypoints." "You're not going," Mercer said. She turned. "You are not going," he repeated. "You have a through and through on the shoulder and you've already taken fire twice today and..." He stopped himself from whatever came next. "You've done your part, Claire. Let Briggs do his." She looked at him for a long moment. "Walk me through the waypoints," Briggs said. His voice had the quality of a man who was going regardless of what happened in the next 30 seconds, and wanted to use those 30 seconds productively. Exactly. She walked him through the waypoints exactly. She had the drainage corridor memorized in the way she had everything memorized, not as abstract directions, but as a physical sequence, each position a sensory fact. The flat boulder at the first turn, the stand of dead trees at the second, the depression in the ground near the logging road that was deep enough to conceal a crouching person from the ridgeline above. Briggs listened with the quality of attention that came from knowing the difference between information that was approximate and information that needed to be exact. He left with 5 soldiers inside 4 minutes. No ceremony. He looked at Claire once on the way out. Something in the look that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite acknowledgement and was maybe something in between that didn't have a good name. Then he was gone. The second mortar round had been the last one. Either they'd run out of ammunition for the tube or they'd redirected resources. Either way, the mortar silence was one less variable in an equation that still had too many. Mercer turned back to the room. There were 3 people left in the command position. Himself, Claire, and Osi, who had stayed because nobody had told him to go anywhere and because he had the particular capacity to be useful by being quiet and attentive in a room full of louder priorities. He was at the radio now, maintaining contact with Vasquez, feeding Mercer updates in the low, continuous voice of someone who understood that information needed to move faster than reactions. Western wall contact is holding, Osei said. Chen's element is under pressure but stable. Eastern approach? He listened. Eastern approach. They're moving faster than the west. Park says they've got a breach attempt forming at the southeastern corner. That's the planned entry point, Claire said. The one from the original assault plan. Which means the Eastern subcommander had access to the original plan. Or he's the original assault commander for that element. Field commanders don't always lead from the center. Sometimes they lead from their own element and coordinate with the others. Mercer looked at her. Which means the Eastern commander might be more capable than whoever took over in the West, yes. She moved to the eastern window. The southeastern corner of the fort was visible from here. The specific section of wall she'd identified in the observation tower as the planned breach point, the place Briggs had repositioned the automatic weapons to cover. Your weapons are covering it? Repositioned at 0415 per your intelligence. How many defenders? 8 on that section. That's enough if they hold the angle. The breach attempt will come from... She stopped. The sound that reached her was wrong, not the sustained rattle of a ground assault, something faster, more targeted, a sequence of shots from outside the northeastern section of the wall, and then, underneath it, the sound of the drainage gate. The drainage gate. The same gate Briggs had taken his element out through 4 minutes ago. Osei, she said. Her voice was level and she was doing something specific to keep it level. Get Briggs on the radio. Osei keyed immediately. Sergeant Briggs, this is command, respond. Static. Sergeant Briggs, static, and then underneath the static, not Briggs' voice but the sound of weapons fire. Close. And then nothing. Mercer was already moving. Claire caught his arm with her right hand, the good arm, and stopped him, which required more force than she expected and cost the shoulder something it could not afford, and she absorbed that cost without letting it reach her face. Stop, she said. Think. That's my element. I know. Think. She let go of his arm. If the drainage corridor was compromised, either they were waiting for it or we were watched from the moment Briggs left. If they were waiting, it's a trap, which means going in after them makes it worse. If we were watched, she stopped, looked at the window, looked at the map. The northeastern section. Someone was on the northeastern section with a line of sight to the north wall. We've had eyes on the northeastern section. Not above the ridgeline. She moved back to the map and pointed to the terrain feature she meant, a high outcropping northeast of the fort that she'd assessed as outside effective range and had therefore weighted accordingly. It was at the edge of the effective window for precision shooting, but inside it for observation. If someone had been positioned there with a spotter's kit, not to shoot but to watch, they would have had a clear view of the north wall and the drainage gate. Spotter! They had a spotter we missed. The admission cost her something different from the shoulder. She didn't look away from it. Briggs is... Osei started. Still potentially operational, Claire said, sharply enough that it stopped him. Radio blackout might be equipment, might be terrain, might be they've gone silent deliberately. Don't write them off on the basis of no radio contact. She looked at Mercer. But we can't wait for confirmation. If the drainage element is compromised, your northwestern wall is about to have a problem from behind. Mercer made 3 decisions in sequence, which was how he made decisions when it mattered. Quickly, in order, without going back. He sent Park's reserve element to the northwestern wall. He had Osei push every available frequency to try to raise Briggs or any member of his element, and he looked at Claire Rowan standing in the command position with blood seeping through Peterson's tape and the rifle still in her hands, and he made the 4th decision, which was the one he'd been not making for the last 20 minutes. "What do you need?" he asked. She was already thinking. He could see it, not the performing of thought, but the actual process, the way her eyes moved without settling, the way she was looking at something that wasn't in the room. "The northeastern section is where they'll push the breach," she said. "Not the southeastern corner anymore. That was the original plan, and the field commander is dead, and whoever is running the eastern element is smart enough to adapt. They've seen us reinforce the southeastern corner. They'll pivot." She looked at him. "The northeastern section has 3 defenders currently?" 4. "I need to be on the northeastern section." "You need to be in medical." "Mercer." "The northeastern section is 40 meters of open wall with no overhead cover and active incoming." "I know what the northeastern section is. I identified it 3 days ago." Her voice had an edge now, not anger exactly, but the thing under anger, the thing that came before it. "I can see the drainage corridor from the northeastern section. If Briggs's element is still functional, I can see where they are and I can cover their approach. And if the eastern assault pivots to the northeastern breach," she looked at the rifle. "I'm out of match-grade rounds, but I'm not out of rounds." A beat. "You took 3 shots at this range today," Mercer said. 2 at shorter range, 1 at 1,200 meters. "With a wound?" "Yes, with a wound." She looked at him, and whatever was behind her eyes was not defiance and was not recklessness. It was closer to the expression of someone who has already paid the price being asked of them and is therefore not afraid of it. "This is what I do, Colonel. Let me do it." Mercer looked at her for 2 seconds. "Osei," he said. "Stay on the radio. Try Briggs every 30 seconds. He looked at Claire. "I'm going with you." "You're the command element? Vasquez is capable of running communication. Park has the walls." He picked up his rifle from where it had been leaning against the table. "This is not a negotiation." She looked at him. He looked back. Something shifted between them. Not agreement exactly, but the end of argument. They went to the northeastern section. The wall here was older than the rest, the stones worn smooth by decades of mountain weather, the gaps in the mortar wider than regulation, and the parapet lower than it should have been. The 4 defenders were spread along 40 meters of it, working short exchanges of fire with an element of the enemy that had positioned in the rock field northeast of the fort, and the incoming fire was accurate enough to have forced all 4 of them to shoot from low angles around the parapet edges rather than over the top. Claire took one look at the geometry of the incoming fire and moved to the far eastern end of the wall section, the angle that was partially shielded by the corner tower's projection. Not covered. The incoming fire could still reach her here, but the sight line to the drainage corridor was clear, and the angle to the rockfield enemy position was workable. She was down and behind the parapet before Mercer had finished positioning himself beside her. "Northern drainage," she said. Mercer looked through his binos in the direction she indicated. The corridor was in shadow still. The morning light hadn't reached the bottom of it yet, which was working for concealment and against observation in roughly equal measure. "There," she pointed. "Movement at the first waypoint." Mercer focused. "I can't." "Second boulder from the left. There's a shape that wasn't there." He found it. A figure, pressed flat against the boulder's shadow. Then a second shape, slightly further back. He exhaled. "That's Briggs. That's his posture. He's pinned. Something between his position and the fort." She scanned. The spotter position, northeast outcropping. Someone moved down from the outcropping into the corridor to cut off Briggs's approach. She found it in the scope. A position in the rocks at the mouth of the corridor, controlling the last 100 meters of approach back to the north wall. "There." "Can you—"
Yes, but if I shoot from here, I give away my position to the rock field element, and we're going to take immediate suppressing fire. How much immediate? Seconds. Mercer looked at the 4 defenders along the wall. He looked at the incoming fire pattern from the rock field. He looked at Claire. Do it, he said. I'll cover. She looked at the blocking position at the corridor mouth. The range was short by the standards of this morning. 280 meters, which was a different kind of problem than 1,200. At 280 meters, you could see the target clearly enough to second-guess yourself. Clearly enough that the human part of the calculation tried to insert itself into the mechanical part, and you had to know how to manage that. She knew how to manage that. The shot was clean. The incoming fire from the rock field shifted to her position within 3 seconds, which was actually a half-second longer than she'd estimated, and Mercer returned fire immediately, and the 4 defenders added to it, and for 15 seconds the northeastern wall was a specific kind of chaos. Controlled on their side, reactive on the enemy's, everyone down behind stone and firing on angles that were all slightly wrong for clean shots, but collectively kept the enemy's heads down. The drainage corridor was clear. Briggs came out of it at a dead run, his element behind him, all 5 of them, which meant he hadn't lost anyone, which was the kind of arithmetic that could make a person feel something complicated when there wasn't time to feel complicated things. Contact at the first waypoint, Briggs said, coming through the interior door at a controlled run and heading directly for his commander. He was bleeding from the left forearm. Not badly, sleeve-soaked rather than dripping, the kind of wound that was filed under non-critical and kept moving. They had a cut-off team in the corridor. We went to ground and held, but the radio took a hit. He looked at Mercer, then at Claire. Corridor is clear now? It's clear, Claire said. What's the flanking element status? Didn't reach them. Cut off before we got eyes on the western element. Doesn't matter, Mercer said. Western element has slowed. Chen's holding the wall. The problem is east. Eastern element is pivoting, Claire said. Northeastern section. They'll probe it in the next 10 minutes. Briggs looked at the wall they'd just come through. He looked at his 5 soldiers, who were positioned and ready with the particular efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough to set up without being told. Then this is where we are. It wasn't a question. This is where we are, Mercer confirmed. 10 minutes became 8. The probe came not as a frontal assault but as a fire and move sequence. A coordinated push from 3 angles simultaneously, suppressive fire from the rock field, a direct approach element using the terrain folds north of the gate, and a third element looping wide to come in on the eastern corner from the outside. It was professional. It was planned. Whoever had inherited command of the eastern element had done it properly. The northeastern wall became the loudest place in the fort. Claire fired from the parapet in short sequences, picking targets at the ranges where the standard rifle round she'd switched to was useful, and avoiding the ranges where it wasn't. The shoulder was a fact she was managing on a round-by-round basis. Each shot absorbed the recoil differently depending on how well she'd managed the position in the seconds before, and some of them were managed well and some of them were not. And the ones that were not produced a specific kind of feedback from the shoulder that she took note of and discarded and continued. Mercer was 2 positions to her left, shooting and calling targets for the defenders, his voice steady in the way that command voice was steady when it was performing steadiness rather than feeling it. Briggs was at the corner, managing the angle against the looping third element. The approach element reached the base of the north wall. This was the moment that mattered, when an assaulting force crossed the dead ground below the parapet and the defenders couldn't angle down far enough to engage. Claire had anticipated this. She'd identified 2 positions on the parapet where the wall's irregularities created low points, places where the mortar had crumbled away in previous years, where the stone had subsided slightly, creating angles that were otherwise useless but became briefly useful when an enemy was at the base of the wall. She moved to the first low point. Incoming fire was heavy, and she moved through it with the focused economy of someone who had decided that movement was safer than staying still and was executing that decision without reconsidering it. She reached the low point. She looked down and angled. The approach element was at the wall. 6 fighters, 2 carrying the kind of equipment used for breaching, which told her the breach attempt was here and now. She fired into that angle 4 times. Not cleanly. The position was awkward.
The shoulder was screaming. The incoming fire was tracking her every time she appeared above the parapet. But she fired 4 times, and the breach team's focus broke. The organized approach fractured into individuals making individual decisions. And in the 15-second window that created, Briggs brought 2 soldiers to her position, and they sustained the fire long enough to push the approach element back into the dead ground below. The third element, which had been looping wide, hit the eastern corner at exactly this moment. Mercer met it personally. Claire heard his rifle, the specific cadence of it, controlled bursts at the corner, and she heard it stop. And for 2 seconds, she couldn't see what had happened because the incoming fire had forced her flat, and those 2 seconds were the longest 2 seconds she'd spent on this particular morning, which already had a strong selection. Then she heard his voice. "Corner's clear. 2 down." She let herself breathe. The assault fractured over the next 4 minutes. Not a clean repulsion. Nothing about any of this was clean. But a fragmentation, the 3-element approach, losing coordination as the approach element fell back, as the flanking element at the corner failed, as the rock field's suppressive fire began to thin out in the way that suppressive fire thinned out, when it was no longer supporting an active assault, and people started thinking about exposure costs. Vasquez's voice came through the radio in the command position, which Ose relayed to the northeastern wall. "All stations. Forward command reports ground element is 40 minutes out. Air assets. Weather has improved sufficiently. Estimated 15 minutes to air support." 15 minutes. Claire looked at the wall, at the defenders, at Mercer coming back from the eastern corner with his rifle and someone else's blood on his jacket sleeve, and the expression of a man who had done something in the last 30 seconds that he would deal with later. 15 minutes was survivable, probably. "We need to hold the northeastern section," she said. "If they regroup and push again before air arrives—" "They won't push again the same way," Briggs said. He was right. They wouldn't, because the same way had failed twice, and there wasn't enough time before air assets arrived to build a third approach from scratch. They might probe, test the walls, but the organized assault is done. Unless there's a third option we haven't identified. Is there? She looked at the valley, at the ridge lines. She ran the geography through everything she knew about it, 3 days of accumulated understanding, and she looked for the things she'd missed. The spotter on the northeastern outcropping she'd underweighted. The cutoff team in the drainage corridor. Both had been surprises, both had almost worked, and someone had planned them. The field commander was dead. She had verified that. Vasquez had verified it from radio intercepts. The Eastern Element commander was capable, but reactive. He'd adapted the breach plan well, but hadn't shown the level of anticipatory thinking that the cutoff team and the spotter had demonstrated, which meant somebody else had pre-planned those elements. Not the field commander and not the Eastern subcommander. She felt it before she could articulate it, the specific texture of a mistake in her own analysis, the place where the picture didn't quite fit together. "Who trained these people?" she said, half to herself. Mercer looked at her. "What?" "The cutoff team in the corridor, the spotter on the northeastern outcropping. Those weren't reactive moves, they were set up before the siege began. Someone anticipated that a sniper might reach this fort. Someone anticipated the specific counter-sniper approach well enough to pre-position assets for it." She looked at the valley. The field commander was good, but good commanders don't pre-plan for scenarios this specific. They plan for categories of problem, not specific solutions. She paused. Someone trained specifically for this kind of operation pre-planned those assets. Someone who knows how this kind of work is done. A silence. "The field commander wasn't the one you needed to worry about," she said quietly. Briggs was watching her. "You think there's someone else?" She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the eastern ridgeline, at the position she'd mapped over 3 days, and she was looking for the thing she'd filed away and not given full weight to. A position, an angle, a pattern of movement that she'd assessed as belonging to an observer and hadn't reassessed since. Second finger from the north, slightly below the primary command antenna she'd taken out with the first shot. A position that had gone quiet after the first shot and had not appeared in any of Vasquez's subsequent radio intercepts. Not because it was empty, because whoever was there had gone quiet deliberately. "There's someone on the eastern ridge," she said. "Second finger, below the antenna I took out this morning." She looked at Mercer. "They've been there the whole time. They went silent when the antenna went down and stayed silent, and I classified the position as abandoned." She kept her voice even. "I was wrong." Mercer looked at the eastern ridge. The morning light was full now, golden and cold, illuminating the ridgeline in detail that the pre-dawn darkness had obscured. The second finger was visible, its terrain features clear. The antenna she'd destroyed was visible, drooping and dark. Below it, at an angle she would have assessed as secondary from the observation tower, was a natural rock formation she'd logged as a personnel position but hadn't flagged as critical because it had shown no radioactivity. "How confident are you?" he asked. 60%. A pause. 70? That someone's there, or that they're a problem? She looked at him. "Both," she said. He held her gaze. Somewhere below the wall, the assault had fractured and the enemy was pulling back to regroup, and in 13 minutes, 12 now, air assets would arrive over the valley and the tactical picture would change completely and irrevocably. 12 minutes. Enough time for a prepared sniper on the eastern ridge to do significant damage to a garrison that had just spent 2 hours in sustained combat and was at the ragged edge of its coherence. Enough time for everything they'd done this morning to come undone. "What do you need?" Mercer said, for the third time this morning, and for the third time, the question meant something different than it had before. Claire checked the rifle. "An angle on the eastern ridge," she said, "and someone who can draw fire for 8 seconds without getting killed." Mercer was quiet for 1 second. "Define draw fire," he said. She told him. He was quiet for another second. "All right," he said. And the way he said it, the flatness of it, the absence of the calculation that usually preceded his decisions, told her that he'd already made the decision before she finished explaining it, that he'd been making it since she said there's someone on the eastern ridge, that some part of Ethan Mercer had decided somewhere in the last 2 hours to trust this woman completely, and was only now catching up to that fact consciously. Briggs looked at both of them. "I don't like this plan," he said. "You don't know the plan yet," Mercer said. "I know enough of it." He looked at Claire. "How certain are you that the position is occupied?" She met his eyes. "Certain enough," she said. He exhaled through his nose. It was the sound of a man who had decided to believe something he couldn't fully verify, which was a thing soldiers did more often than anyone who hadn't been a soldier understood. "Clock's running," he said. It was. 11 minutes to air support. Somewhere on the eastern ridge, below a destroyed antenna, something waited in the rocks that Claire had overlooked, and now couldn't stop thinking about. She moved to find her angle. The angle she needed was on the southern face of the northeastern tower, a position that required climbing 12 feet of exterior stonework to reach a natural ledge that the fort's original builders had probably used for exactly this kind of purpose, and that nobody had used in the modern era because it was exposed, uncomfortable, and required trusting 19th century mortar with your body weight. Claire tested the first handhold with her right arm, found it solid, and started climbing. The shoulder announced its opinion immediately and at volume. She processed the announcement and continued climbing. Briggs watched from below with an expression that had moved past objection into something that looked like a man cataloging things he would need to describe later to people who hadn't been there. Mercer was already moving to his position, 40 meters east along the wall, the place that would give him the sightline to the eastern ridge and, simultaneously, give the occupant of that ridge a sightline to him. That was the plan. Mercer would be visible. The position on the ridge would react, and in the window between the reaction and the impact, a window measured in fractions of a second that Claire had done the math on and decided was workable, she would have the angle from the ledge to take the shot. It was not a good plan. It was the plan available. She reached the ledge at 11 feet, found her footing on the narrow stone, and pressed herself flat against the tower face. The eastern ridge was visible from here in a way it hadn't been from the parapet. The elevation change was only 11 feet. But in mountain terrain, 11 feet of elevation changed sight lines significantly, cutting around the terrain folds that had been blocking the direct view to the second finger. She found the position in the scope, the rock formation below the destroyed antenna. Natural cover, a cluster of granite slabs that had sheared and collapsed against each other over centuries into a rough V-shape that a person could fit inside and be invisible from below while maintaining a clear view of the fort's interior. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Someone was in there. Not visible. Nothing so simple as a visible human outline.
But the position had the quality that occupied positions had when the occupant was good. A certain density of shadow, a stillness that was slightly too deliberate, the absence of the random environmental movement that an empty position would show. Wind moved through rock formations. It moved debris, dust, small vegetation. The V-shaped position was moving the way a position moved when something inside it was damping the natural movement. "Mercer," she said into the radio. Her voice was quiet. "I have the position. Give me 15 seconds to settle before you move." His voice came back. "Copy." She settled. Shoulder against the tower stone, right arm taking the rifle's weight, left arm contributing what it could, which was less than she wanted. The ledge was 8 inches wide and her feet were positioned wrong, and she adjusted them once and decided the adjustment was sufficient and stopped adjusting. The wind was doing the morning thing. She read it. "Whenever you're ready," she said. A 2-second pause. Then Mercer stepped up onto the wall walk at the eastern section, into the open, above the parapet line, fully visible against the morning sky. It took 4 seconds. The muzzle flash from the V-shaped position was small and suppressed. She almost missed it against the rock's shadow, but almost was not the same as did, and she had been watching for it with the kind of attention that was not entirely conscious, the accumulated skill of years telling her eyes where to be before her brain caught up. She fired. The recoil hit the shoulder and the shoulder sent its signal, and she absorbed both and kept the scope on target. The V-shaped position changed, not dramatically, not the way movie deaths looked, which was always too much, always operatic, more like a shift in the density she'd been reading. The particular stillness that had told her someone was there became a different kind of stillness, and the small movements she'd been tracking at the edges of the position ceased in the specific way that movement ceased when the thing causing it was no longer capable of causing it. She held the position in the scope for 4 more seconds. Nothing moved that shouldn't move. Below her, Mercer was flat behind the parapet. He'd dropped the moment she fired, which meant he'd heard the shot, which meant he was intact. She processed this with the particular relief of a person who has spent the last 30 seconds not thinking about the possibility of the opposite outcome. "Clear," she said into the radio. A pause. "Copy clear," Mercer said. His voice was level and had the texture of a man who had just stood up on a wall in a sniper's sight line by choice and was now on the other side of that decision. She started to climb down. The descent was harder than the climb for reasons the shoulder made obvious, and she reached the ground in a way that was functional rather than graceful, and that left her leaning against the tower base for 3 seconds while her body recalibrated. Briggs was there. He didn't say anything. He put a hand briefly on her right shoulder, not the wounded side, and then removed it. That was it. That was all of it. "Radio," she said. He handed her his handset. "Vasquez, Eastern Ridge, second finger below the antenna. Position is down. What's your read on the overall situation?" Vasquez's voice came back immediately, and the texture of it was different from how it had sounded 2 hours ago. Not relaxed, nothing as simple as that, but the specific timbre of someone whose catastrophe estimate has revised downward significantly. "Western element has completely stopped. Chen reports no contact for 4 minutes. Eastern element is fragmenting. I've got 3 separate groups on different frequencies arguing about who's in command, and none of them are giving orders that sound like attack orders. Air assets? 7 minutes out. Forward command confirms." She handed the radio back to Briggs. 7 minutes. She let herself sit down against the tower base, which was not a decision she consciously made, but rather something her legs decided for her, and she was too tired and too much in pain to argue with her legs about it. The morning had a quality now that it hadn't had at any point since she'd climbed to the maintenance platform at 0445. It was still cold. The mountains were still there, still indifferent in the way mountains were, and the valley below still had people in it who had been trying to kill 94 soldiers for 76 hours. But the quality of the situation had changed in the way situations changed when they crossed from one side of a threshold to another. Still hard, still costly, but no longer accelerating toward the worst version of itself. Mercer came around the corner of the tower on foot. He looked at her sitting against the wall. He sat down next to her, which was not something she'd expected a colonel to do,
but she'd stopped predicting what Mercer would do sometime around the third hour of this morning. "Position is confirmed down," he said. "Vasquez has eyes through the scope we set up on the western tower. Single occupant. He had a satellite phone, not a radio. That's why we didn't pick him up on comms intercepts. Satellite phone. Encrypted, military grade, not standard equipment for a militia group." He looked at his hands, then at the ridge. "Who was he?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the V-shaped position on the ridge, visible now in the full morning light, 300 and some meters away. Small, inconspicuous. She had almost missed it. But he was trained the same way I was trained. The pre-positioning of the cutoff team, the spotter on the northeast outcropping, the way the counter-sniper response was built. That's a specific methodology. There aren't many people who teach it. Mercer looked at her. "Vasilyev?" "Victor didn't train people for this side of the line." She said it flatly, not defensively. "But he wasn't the only person who came up through that program. There were others." A pause. "Some of them made different choices." Mercer let that sit. He didn't push it. That was when the sound changed. The rotors, distant at first, and then rapidly less distant. The specific acoustic signature of military helicopters coming in fast and low over the northern ridgeline. 3 of them, in a formation that meant business, and below in the valley, the enemy radio traffic that Vasquez was monitoring apparently reached the same conclusion, because what had been argument and confusion suddenly became something much more urgent and much more focused on not being where they currently were. The relief force was 8 minutes behind the helicopters. It arrived in trucks up the logging road that the enemy's reserve element had vacated in a hurry, and the soldiers who came out of those trucks had the energy of people who had been staged and waiting and frustrated and were now moving, and they swept the valley approaches with an efficiency that made the whole thing look, from the fort's walls, almost straightforward. It had not been straightforward. 94 soldiers alive, 2 seriously wounded, including the shoulder wound Peterson had been unhappy about since 0600, 14 with minor injuries. The fort itself, damaged but standing. The enemy positions, collapsed, fragmented. The organizational coherence that had made them effective for 76 hours, dissolved by a combination of command disruption and the arrival of air assets that changed the fundamental calculation. The debrief began before the relief force had fully secured the perimeter. The officer who led it was a lieutenant colonel named Hartwell, and he arrived in the second truck with a tablet computer and an expression that communicated several things simultaneously: relief that the situation had been resolved, professional assessment of the resolution's quality, and a particular kind of careful attention that senior officers developed for situations that didn't fit neatly into the frameworks they'd been trained with. He set up in the fort's main room, the same room where Claire had first laid out the enemy positions from memory 12 hours ago, and he asked for the commanding officer and the primary intelligence asset. Mercer sat at the table. Claire sat 2 seats down from him, which was where she'd ended up, and which she didn't adjust. Briggs stood against the wall with his arms crossed, which was where Briggs always ended up. Hartwell looked at Claire for a long moment before he said anything. "You're not in the system," he said. "Not accusatory. Observational." "No." "General Vasilyev sent you." "Yes." "Victor Vasilyev is retired and has no operational authority." "That's accurate." Hartwell looked at Mercer. "You admitted a civilian into a besieged military installation?" "I admitted an asset with valid authentication credentials and operational intelligence that proved accurate across 12 hours of active contact," Mercer said. His voice was the voice of a man who had made a decision he was prepared to defend and was not going to waste energy on preemptive apology. "She saved this garrison. She conducted unauthorized offensive operations. She conducted the only offensive operations available to us." Mercer put his hands flat on the table. "With respect, sir, we were 40 hours from the point where I would have been drafting surrender terms. I will stand behind every decision made in this installation over the last 76 hours. All of them." Hartwell looked at him for a moment. "I'm not here to assign blame, Colonel." He turned back to Claire. "I need to understand what happened, completely, starting from General Vasilyev's contact with you." She told him. She told it the way she told things, in sequence, without embellishment, with the specific detail that mattered and without the detail that didn't. The 3 days in the valley, the intelligence collected, the 3 shots, the shoulder, the 4th shot. When she got to the 4th shot, Hartwell looked up from his tablet. The position on the eastern ridge. Yes. Satellite phone, military-grade encryption, counter-sniper methodology suggesting advanced training. He set the tablet down. Do you know who he was? She'd had time to think about it. Sitting against the tower base after the helicopters arrived, while Mercer handled the immediate coordination and Briggs managed the relief force integration, she'd had time to run the analysis she'd been deferring because there hadn't been time for it. His name was probably Rashid Karim, she said, or he used that name. He trained under the same program I did, approximately 3 to 4 years after me. He disappeared from the program under circumstances that weren't publicly explained. She looked at the table. Victor told me about him once. He said Rashid was the most technically gifted student he'd ever had, and that technical gifts without the right foundation were the most dangerous possible combination. You knew him? We never met. I knew of him. And you didn't flag this when you identified the counter-sniper elements. It wasn't quite a question. No, she said. I didn't recognize the methodology until I'd already made the incorrect assessment of the ridge position. By the time I'd connected it, she stopped, not avoiding the accountability, just finding the precise language for it. I was wrong about the ridge position. I assessed it as cleared, and it wasn't. That error almost cost Colonel Mercer his life. Mercer made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a protest. It was my error, she said, not looking at him. That's accurate. Hartwell looked at her carefully. He had the quality of someone who was recalibrating in real time, who had come in with a framework for this situation and was finding that the framework needed adjusting. Why didn't you flag Kareem's possible involvement earlier when you first identified the pre-positioned counter-sniper elements? Because I didn't know it was him. I identified the elements as the work of someone with specific training. There are maybe 20 people in the world who could have designed those elements, and I don't know who most of them are. She looked at Hartwell directly. And because I was managing a shoulder wound and an active assault in approximately 11 simultaneous problems, I prioritized incorrectly. I should have thought it through earlier. But you did think it through. Eventually. In time. She didn't respond to that. The framing of it, in time as though the timing were a virtue rather than a near thing, was not the framing she would have chosen. Briggs, from the wall. She identified the position 30 seconds before the eastern element hit the northeastern section in force. If she'd identified it 30 seconds later, I know what 30 seconds later would have meant, Hartwell said. Not harshly. He looked at his tablet. He looked at Claire. What's your read on Kareem's presence here? What was he doing? Advising, possibly training. The 3 militia groups merging under coordinated command didn't happen organically. Someone facilitated it, built the communication architecture, did the planning work that independent militia groups don't typically do. Kareem has the skills for that. The siege of this fort was more tactically sophisticated than 3 independent groups should be able to produce, the pre-positioned counter-sniper elements especially. She thought about the V-shaped position, the satellite phone, the methodology. He's been in this valley for a while, longer than the siege. Months? At minimum. Hartwell wrote something. He was quiet for a moment. General Vasiliev, he said. What's his current status? The question landed differently than it was probably intended to. Claire looked at the table. She looked at a knot in the wood of it, a natural imperfection in the surface that she fixed her eyes on while she found the answer. When I last spoke to him, he was stable. He's been ill for several months. She paused. He has contacts who are monitoring the satellite feeds from this valley. He would have been following the situation in real time. Can we contact him? You can try. I don't know if he'll be... She stopped, started again. I'd recommend trying. Hartwell nodded. He made a note. He looked at Mercer. The garrison? 94 personnel, all accounted for. 94 alive. 2 requiring medical evacuation. Mercer's voice was steady and professional in the way it had been all morning, carrying its own kind of exhaustion underneath that steadiness. Private Caruso was KYA on day 1, 76 hours ago. I'm sorry. Yes. A pause that had weight in it. We'll do the paperwork. Hartwell closed the tablet. He looked around the room, at Mercer, at Claire, at Briggs against the wall, with an expression that had something in it that wasn't quite admiration, wasn't quite discomfort, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I'm going to need full written statements from everyone present, he said. This debrief is preliminary. The formal review will take— How long? Mercer asked. Weeks, possibly longer. The use of an unauthorized civilian asset in an active combat zone, the offensive operations conducted under non-standard command authority. He looked at Claire. There are questions that need formal answers. I understand, she said. You may face sanctions. I understand that too. He studied her. You don't seem particularly concerned. I'm concerned about a lot of things, she said. The formal review is not currently in the top 5. Hartwell looked at her for a moment longer. Then, in a different register, quieter, less official, he said, 94 people. Yes. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. He stood. Mercer stood. The formal portion of the preliminary debrief was apparently complete, which meant the informal portion was beginning, which was always the part where the actual information moved. Mercer walked Hartwell to the door of the main room, and they spoke in the low, sustained voices of officers conducting coordination. Claire remained at the table. Peterson appeared at some point and looked at her shoulder with the expression of a man who had expected his tape job to hold for 2 hours and was now processing the fact that it had held for 8. You need a surgeon, he said. I know. Not a field surgeon, a real one. The clavicle region is Peterson. Complex, and I can't evaluate the— Peterson. I know. I'll get on the first medical evacuation. He looked at her with the specific skepticism of someone who had spent the day watching her make decisions about her own body that he disagreed with. You'll actually get on it. Yes. You're not going to find a reason to stay. I'm not going to find a reason to stay. She looked at him. The situation is resolved. He appeared to consider whether he believed this. He apparently decided that he did, or at least that pressing further was unlikely to improve the probability, because he nodded and went back to his kit. Briggs came to the table and sat down across from her. He did it the way Briggs did everything, without announcement, without asking whether it was welcome, as though the appropriate action was obvious and he was simply taking it. Kareem, he said. Yes. You trained under the same person. Yes. How long did you know it was him? She looked at Briggs. He had the quality she had noticed over the course of this morning of someone who asked questions he already partially knew the answers to, not to trap, but to give the other person the opportunity to arrive at the answer themselves. I suspected when I identified the cutoff team, she said. I didn't let myself follow it because I didn't have confirmation, and following it would have changed how I was operating, the bias risk. She paused. If you're looking for a person you know, you start seeing them. You start reading the evidence toward confirmation instead of reading it toward accuracy. I couldn't afford that bias in the middle of— She gestured at everything outside the walls. All of that. So you set it aside. I set the hypothesis aside. I kept the evidence and let it build. She looked at the table. I should have followed it faster. The satellite phone would have told me. Militias don't run military-grade encrypted satellite phones. I assessed it as an anomaly instead of as a confirmation. You were also running on no sleep and a bullet hole. That's not an excuse for bad analysis. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Was it bad analysis or was it human analysis? She looked at him. He looked back at her with the calm of a man who was not going to retract the question. Sometimes the difference matters, he said. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was complicated, and her capacity for complicated things had been substantially reduced by approximately 8 hours of sustained crisis and blood loss. Mercer came back to the table. He sat down heavily. Not dramatically, just the weight of a man sitting down after a long time standing. He looked at both of them. Hartwell is processing it, he said. The review, Claire said. The whole thing. He's not hostile. He's just dealing with something that doesn't fit the paperwork, and that takes time. He looked at Claire. He's going to recommend commendation alongside the review. That seems contradictory. Welcome to institutions. He rubbed his face with both hands. The gesture was so genuinely tired that it was almost startling. Mercer had been operating on command energy for so long this morning that the brief unguarded moment of exhaustion was more human than anything else he'd shown. Viktor Vasilyev, how is he actually? She was quiet. He was watching the feeds, she said. He would have been following it in real time. Up until... She stopped. Until what? She looked at her hands. There was blood on them, dried. Her own, from the shoulder. She'd washed them at some point and it had come back, the way blood did when the wound was still active. He told me, when he called, that he'd been trying to reach me for 2 days and the satellite kept dropping. His voice was different from how it usually is. She found the words slowly, not performing reluctance, but genuinely finding them. Lung cancer. He didn't tell anyone for months. He's been managing it on his own because that's what he does, because he spent 40 years deciding that his problems were his to carry and other people's problems were his to solve. A pause. He said that when he saw the Fort Raven situation, he knew it was solvable. He was very certain about it. He said he knew because he'd trained the person who could solve it. She stopped. Mercer looked at her. Briggs looked at the table. The room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet that happened when something that had been implied all morning was finally said plainly. He also said, she stopped again. Something was happening in her face. Not breakdown, nothing so simple. More like the specific kind of controlled suppression that people who had been managing difficult things for a long time engaged in when the difficult things tried to move. He said the $40 was real. He said you should pay it back and that he'd find a way to spend it. Mercer made a sound. He turned toward the window. He looked at the valley for a moment. When he turned back, his eyes were dry and his expression was professional. And if there was something working underneath it, it was working quietly and privately, which was his right. We need to get you on a medevac, he said. Yes. Peterson's been waiting. I know. She stood. The shoulder responded immediately to the change in position, and she stood through it, which she'd been doing all morning, which was by now a practiced thing. Claire, Mercer said. She looked back. The $40, he said. What would he spend it on? She thought about it. She thought about Viktor Vasilyev in a hospital bed with a satellite feed, listening to a mountain valley through encrypted signals, following a battle he'd sent his last student into in his last months, doing the thing he'd done for 40 years, solving other people's problems from whatever distance was available to him. Terrible coffee, she said. He has very bad taste in coffee. It was one of his few genuine flaws. Mercer almost smiled. It arrived and stayed this time, not the brief flicker she'd seen on him all morning, but something that settled in and held for a full second before it moved on. Get on the medevac, he said. She went. The helicopter was on the outer clearing north of the fort, its rotors still turning, and Peterson walked her out with his kit and his expression of sustained medical disapproval, and the relief force medic who was running the evacuation looked at Claire's shoulder and then looked at Peterson with an expression that asked a question. Peterson answered with a shrug that said, I know, don't ask me. The valley was bright now, full morning, the shadows pulled back to the ridgelines, the mountains doing what mountains did in clear light, becoming very large and very still and very indifferent to everything that had happened in the small cold spaces between them. Somewhere on the eastern ridge, the position she'd cleared was being processed by the relief force. She didn't watch them go up to it. She'd done what needed doing there, and looking at it again served no purpose she could identify. She sat in the helicopter door while Peterson did the things Peterson needed to do, and she looked at the fort, at the walls, at the northeastern section where the stone was darker from weapons residue, at the maintenance platform visible at the top of the tower, at the gate that she'd knocked on in the pre-dawn dark what felt like several days ago but was actually 9 hours. 94 people. She had not saved them cleanly. She had made errors. The ridge position, the delayed analysis of Kareem's involvement, the shoulder wound that had compromised the third shot's margin to a degree she would have found unacceptable in a planning scenario. She had been wrong about things that had nearly been catastrophic, and she had been right about things that had made the difference. And the space between those two categories was smaller than she'd like and larger than it could have been. That was the math that actually mattered. Not the clean version, not the version that became lesson plans and debrief summaries and commendation citations. The version where the margin was as narrow as it was, and they were all still alive anyway. She thought about Victor's voice on the satellite call, the different quality of it, the certainty he'd had, not performance, not the professional confidence he'd always projected, but something quieter and more deliberate, the certainty of someone who had decided what they wanted their last decision to be and had made it. He had been right. She pressed her hand against the shoulder and looked at the mountains. The helicopter lifted. Below, Mercer was standing outside the fort's gate, watching it rise. He didn't wave. She didn't either. He just stood there, looking up at the helicopter with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who is going to carry this day with him for the rest of his career, not as a burden, as a fact. The kind of fact that changed the shape of how you understood things. At 300 feet, the valley spread out below her in its full form. The horseshoe of ridgelines, the fragmented enemy positions now quiet, the fort at the center of it looking simultaneously ancient and somehow surviving. She could see from this height the geometry of the whole thing in a way she hadn't been able to see from inside it. The angles, the distances, the specific terrible arithmetic of 94 people in a situation that the math had said was finished. The math had been wrong. She turned forward and watched the mountains open up around the helicopter and didn't look back again. The surgical team at Forward Medical was waiting when the helicopter landed. They were professional and fast, and they had opinions about the shoulder that they expressed in the clipped, efficient language of people who dealt with preventable worsening as a recurring professional irritation. The lead surgeon, a woman named Okafor, who had the focused energy of someone permanently operating on insufficient sleep, looked at Peterson's tape job with an expression that moved from assessment to something approaching reluctant approval. "Field pack held," she said. Not to Claire. To the tape itself, apparently. "I told him to do it that way," Claire said. "I know." He called ahead. Okafor looked at her directly for the first time. "You were shooting after this?" "Yes." "How many times?" "Several." Okafor made the sound that surgeons made when patients confirmed what the imaging had already told them. She looked at the shoulder from 3 angles with the hands-on thoroughness of someone who trusted their own assessment over everything else. "The clavicle has a hairline fracture. The bullet nicked it on exit. You've been shooting on a hairline fracture for..." She checked the timeline Peterson had sent. 6 hours. Approximately. That's... She stopped herself from whatever she'd been about to say and replaced it with, "We'll need to discuss what recovery looks like." "After the surgery." "Yes, after the surgery." The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Claire was under for all of it, which was the longest she'd been unconscious in the past 31 hours. And when she came back up through the anesthesia, it was to the specific disorientation of a person whose body had been somewhere difficult and whose mind was catching up on a delay. The room was white and quiet and smelled like antiseptic, and the light had the flat quality of afternoon filtering through frosted windows. She lay there for a moment and let the information arrive in pieces. Surgery done, shoulder immobilized, IV in the right arm. The particular dense quiet of a medical facility that was busy elsewhere, but not in this room, not right now. There was a phone on the bedside table. Not her phone, a facility phone, placed there by someone. Next to it was a piece of paper with a number written in handwriting she didn't recognize. She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she picked up the phone. The number connected after 2 rings. A voice she didn't know. Male, careful, the specific cadence of someone managing information for someone else. "This is Reyes. I've been expecting your call." "Who are you?" "I work with General Vasilyev. He asked me to give you this number when you were out of the field." A pause. "He said you'd call within an hour of waking up." She looked at the ceiling. "What time is it?" she asked. 14:20. She'd been awake for 11 minutes. "Tell him he was wrong." A longer pause. When Reyes spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Still careful, but carrying something underneath the careful that she recognized as the quality of bad news being professionally managed. "Miss Rowan," he said. She knew before he continued. "General Vasilyev passed away this morning," Reyes said. "At approximately 0847, he was listening to the Valley feed." Another pause. "He heard the all clear from forward command before..." He stopped. He heard it. The room was very quiet. Claire held the phone against her ear and looked at the frosted window and the flat afternoon light coming through it, and did not say anything for long enough that Reyes said her name again, carefully. "He heard it," she said. "Yes." "You're certain?" "I was with him. Yes." She put her free hand flat against the bed beside her. The IV pulled slightly at the motion, and she ignored it. Viktor Vassiliev had spent 40 years solving other people's problems from whatever distance was available to him. He had built a methodology, trained a generation of people who carried pieces of it in their muscle memory and their decision-making and the way they read wind. He had been dying for months and hadn't told anyone except, apparently, Reyes, because he had decided that his problems were his to carry. He had used his last operational decision to send her into a mountain valley to save 94 people he'd never met, because a colonel he'd played cards with once had run out of options, and Viktor Vassiliev was constitutionally incapable of watching a solvable problem go unsolved. He had died knowing it worked. She understood, in this moment, that this was exactly what he would have chosen. Not in a comforting way. Understanding a thing clearly was not the same as being at peace with it, and she was not at peace with it. But she understood it. The shape of it was completely consistent with everything she knew about the man, and that consistency was, at minimum, a fact to hold on to when everything else was moving. "His arrangements?" she asked. "He handled them in advance. He was thorough." Reyes's voice had something in it now that wasn't professional, just briefly. "He left something for you. A letter. He wrote it 3 weeks ago." A pause. "He said you should read it when the job was finished." "Where is it?" "I can courier it to wherever you are." She gave him the facility name. He read it back correctly, which meant he'd already known where she was, which meant Victor had already known where she'd end up, which was so completely characteristic that she almost said something about it, and then didn't. "Reyes," she said. What else did he say? A quiet that lasted long enough to mean something. "He said," Reyes stopped, started again. "He said to tell you that the debt was never yours." Those were his exact words. He was very specific about me getting that right. Another pause. "I didn't know what it meant. I thought maybe you would." She closed her eyes. The debt was never yours. She had been carrying it for 4 years. A mission that had gone wrong in a way that missions went wrong. Not through malice, not through incompetence, but through the specific terrible convergence of imperfect information and imperfect conditions and decisions that were defensible at the time and catastrophic in their outcome. 4 people. Not combatants. A village in a mountain region not unlike the one she'd spent the last 3 days in, and a decision upstream in the intelligence chain that she'd been given as confirmed and that had not been confirmed, and she had acted on it, and 4 people had died who should not have died. She had known, afterward, that something upstream was wrong. She had flagged it. The report existed somewhere, as her report about the militia merger had existed somewhere, and it had gone where reports went when institutions decided they were inconvenient. Victor had known the truth. He'd known it from the beginning, had known what she'd been given and what she hadn't been given, and whose decision the intelligence call had actually been. He had told her after that the investigation was ongoing. He had told her after that the findings were classified. He had not told her, for 4 years he had not told her, that the accountability had settled somewhere that wasn't her. She understood why. She didn't agree with it, but she understood it. Viktor Vassiliev had spent 40 years navigating the space between what institutions did and what justice required. And he had made the calculation that telling her would be less useful than letting her carry it until she'd done enough to believe, on her own terms, that carrying it hadn't been the whole of her. She disagreed with that calculation. She was also aware that she was right now in a medical facility, alive because he had made it and others hadn't been made. "Thank you," she said to Reyes. "Send the letter." She put the phone down. The letter arrived 2 days later, by which point Claire had been moved to a standard recovery room and had conducted 3 more sessions with Hartwell's formal review team via secure video from a tablet propped on her bedside table. The review was proceeding in the way institutional reviews proceeded, slowly, carefully, with significant attention paid to the paperwork implications of events that the paperwork systems hadn't been designed to accommodate. Hartwell himself had called once, outside the formal sessions. "The identity of the Eastern Ridge position has been confirmed," he said. "Rashid Karim. He was in the intelligence system under a different name. He'd been operating in the region for 14 months. A pause. "Your assessment of his role was accurate. The militia coordination, the communication architecture, the tactical sophistication, it all leads back to him. And the satellite phone? Traced to a procurement chain that goes somewhere we're still untangling. He wasn't working alone in the logistical sense. His voice was careful in the way it was careful when he was moving toward something. The pre-positioned counter-sniper elements, the fact that he anticipated your approach methodology specifically." He paused. "Did Vasiliev know Karim was in the region?" She had thought about this. "I don't know," she said, which was true. "Victor tracked a lot of things through back channels. It's possible." She paused. "If he knew, he didn't tell me." "Why not?" "Because knowing it was him would have changed how I operated. Victor understood operational bias risks." She looked at the window. "Or he didn't know. Both are possible." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "The review is going to take the position that the operation was justified by necessity and outcomes. The commendation will be formally processed." He paused again. "There will be a recommendation that the intelligence failure, the report you filed about the militia merger that wasn't acted on, be reviewed as a contributing factor to the Fort Raven situation. That review won't go anywhere." "Probably not, but it'll be on record." Something in his voice shifted. "You were right, Ms. Rowan. 6 weeks before the siege, you were right, and the report sat in a queue. 94 people almost died because of a queue." He said it flatly, not dramatically, just the fact of it. "I wanted you to know that I've noted it." She looked at the ceiling. "Thank you," she said. The letter from Victor arrived in a plain envelope, couriered by Reyes personally. A small man with careful hands who knocked on the recovery room door and handed it over without commentary and left without being asked to stay, which told her that Victor had briefed him thoroughly on how she operated. She held the envelope for a while. It was a standard white envelope, her name on the front in Victor's handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a different country, in a different era, slightly formal, the letters fully formed where modern handwriting tended to abbreviate. She'd seen that handwriting on mission briefings, on training assessments, on one birthday card that had arrived 3 years ago with nothing inside it except a hand-drawn diagram of a wind correction calculation with a note that said, "You're still doing this wrong on the eastern axis. Happy birthday." She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages. She read it once through without stopping. Then she put it face down on the bed and looked at the window for a long time. He had written about the mission 4 years ago. He had written about it with the specific clarity of a man who had decided that clarity was what he owed her, and that timing was a separate question from owing. He had written down what the intelligence assessment had actually said, who had signed off on the confirmation that hadn't been confirmed, what the internal review had found, and why the findings had been sealed. He had written it all down, in sequence, precisely. He had written, "I should have told you this 3 years ago. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I think the truth is that I was afraid of what it would change between us. That was a selfish decision. I'm not proud of it." She read that paragraph 3 times. Viktor Vasiliev, who had spent 40 years being afraid of very few things, had been afraid of this. The specific fear of a person who had built something, a relationship, a methodology, a trust, and couldn't predict what happened to it when the full truth arrived. He had written, on the last page, "The debt was never yours. It was mine. Mine for the intelligence failure I knew about and didn't surface. Mine for the years I let you carry something that belonged to a different accounting. I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm not sorry I sent you to Fort Raven. You were the right person. You were always the right person. That part I knew." And at the very bottom, in different ink, written later, added after the rest, "They made it out. All of them. I heard the confirmation before I heard it. You did what I knew you could do. Stop counting the debt. There's nothing left on the ledger. She folded the letter carefully. She put it back in the envelope. She did not cry, which was not because she didn't feel it, but because the feeling was too large and too complicated for crying, which was a small valve for a big pressure, and she sat with it instead, sat with the whole weight of it, the 4 years and the mission and the 94 people and the mountain valley and Victor dying in a hospital bed listening to a satellite feed to hear whether his last decision had worked. It had worked. She sat with that too. Mercer came to the facility on the 4th day. He came in civilian clothes, which made him look simultaneously like himself, and like someone she might not have recognized out of context. The command posture was still there, stitched into the way he moved, but without the uniform it was less obvious, more personal. He had a paper cup of coffee that he'd apparently brought from outside the facility because the facility coffee was, by consensus of everyone who had interacted with it, not worth the effort. He knocked on the open door of the recovery room. "Colonel," she said. "You can call me Ethan." He looked at the shoulder, the sling, the way she was positioned to keep it immobilized. "Surgeon says 6 weeks. 8. She was being optimistic at 6. He sat in the chair that had been pulled up beside the bed for visitors, and which nobody had visited her in yet. He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared several things to say and was now deciding which ones were actually necessary. "Victor?" he said. "Yes." "Reyes told me. He called the fort." A pause. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He would have... Mercer stopped. He would have had something precise to say about how this went, some specific observation that made everything else feel obvious in retrospect. He always did. She looked at the cup in his hands. "Is that terrible?" "The coffee?" He looked at it. "Yes. I got it from the cart outside. I don't know why I thought it would be better than whatever's in here." "Solidarity," she said. Victor would have approved. He had no standards for coffee. Mercer almost smiled, held it this time. They were quiet for a moment with the comfortable quality of two people who had been through something together that created a different kind of silence than ordinary silence. "The review," he said. "Hartwell briefed me. You're going to be cleared." "Probably. With conditions and documentation and at least 2 years of file reviews." She shifted the shoulder slightly and processed the result. "It doesn't matter. I wasn't operating inside the system to begin with." "Does that mean you're going to keep not operating inside the system?" She looked at him. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He was sitting forward slightly, the coffee forgotten. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true in a way it hadn't been true before the last week. She had come to Fort Raven because Victor had asked her to. She had operated outside the system because the system had failed and the alternative was 94 people dying in a mountain pass. But Hartwell's careful, steady, institutional response to all of it, the review, the record, the note about the intelligence failure, had the quality of a system trying, imperfectly, to correct itself. An imperfect correction was not nothing. "The formal review," Mercer said, "when it's done. There are people I know, see, outside the standard channels but connected, who work on situations like Fort Raven before they become Fort Raven, the identification stage." He looked at her. "You filed a report 6 weeks out that nobody read. If someone had read it, I know. There's an argument to be made that the position you're in, outside the system, with the skills you have, is less useful than being in a position where the reports get read." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a significant argument," she said. "I'm not making it. I'm noting that it exists." He paused. "Though I suppose I'm making it a little." She looked at the window, at the flat gray sky visible through it, overcast, the mountains somewhere behind it, in the direction she couldn't see from here. "Victor spent 40 years inside the system," she said. "He shaped things from inside it, built the methodology, trained the people, influenced decisions that he could never officially be credited with. And he spent 40 years watching the reports not get read and the intelligence failures not get addressed, and the Rashid Kareems of the world fall through gaps that nobody wanted to officially acknowledge existed." She paused. I don't know if that's an argument for being inside or being outside. I think it might be an argument for there not being a clean answer. Mercer looked at his coffee. No, he said. Probably not a clean answer. They sat with that. 94 people, he said eventually. Yes. I keep counting them. He said it without embarrassment, the admission of a man who had accepted his own accounting processes. In my head, I keep counting them, putting names to the count. Osei, Park, Chen, Briggs. He stopped. I counted them every night of the siege, worst 3 nights of my career. Now I count them because they're all still there to count. She understood this. She had her own version of it. Not the same names, different missions, different valleys, and different walls. The counting that went both ways, the names that were still there and the ones that weren't. Caruso, she said. Private Caruso, 19 years old, somewhere outside Tulsa. The one who hadn't made it to her arrival. Yes, Mercer said. Caruso too. Another silence. Honest this time, without weight. Just the space between 2 people who were carrying something and had decided they didn't need to fill every moment of it with words. He stood eventually, which was when she noticed he'd left an envelope on the chair arm. Standard white, her name on it. From Briggs, he said. He doesn't write letters. He said to tell you that. He said this is the first letter he's written since mandatory pen pal assignments in 5th grade, and he'd appreciate it if you didn't mention it to anyone. She picked up the envelope. He came to the fort with 17 years of service, Mercer said at the door. He's putting in for his 18th. He said... He paused, seeming to organize Briggs's message into transmittable form. He said he reconsidered some things on the northeastern wall and decided that the general work of keeping people alive was a reasonable thing to keep doing. She looked at the envelope. Tell him that's the right call, she said. I will. Mercer left. His footsteps went down the corridor and faded out. She opened Briggs's letter. It was 2 paragraphs, handwritten in the compressed, practical script of a man who communicated efficiently, even in personal correspondence. The first paragraph described, with functional specificity, the morning after the relief force arrived, how the garrison had gathered in the courtyard at sunrise, not at anyone's order, just because they did, 93 people standing in the cold accounting for each other. He described Osei, who had cried without apparent embarrassment. He described Chen, who had not but who had stood with his hand on Kowalski's shoulder for a long time without moving. He described Park, who had sat down on the ground in the middle of the courtyard and put his face in his hands and stayed like that until someone brought him coffee. The second paragraph said, I've been doing this for 17 years and I don't know how to say what I want to say about the last 31 hours, except that I was wrong and you were right, and I don't usually admit that, and you should know that I know that. Also, the letter from the observation tower thing was my idea, and Mercer took credit for it in the debrief report, and I want the record to reflect that. She read the second paragraph twice. She put both letters in the same envelope and put the envelope in her bag, which was on the floor beside the bed. The recovery room had gotten darker while Mercer was there. The afternoon moving toward evening without announcing itself. The gray sky at the window deepening into the specific blue-gray of mountain dusk. She'd been in this room for 4 days, and she knew the light patterns of it, the way the afternoon moved across the frosted glass, the point in the evening when the facility's interior lights became the primary light source and the window became a mirror. She was nearly at that point. She thought about what came next. It was a thing she'd been not thinking about, deliberately, because there had always been something more immediate requiring attention, and because the question of what came next had been, for 4 years, less about direction and more about distance. About putting enough missions between herself and the accounting that the ledger felt manageable. Victor had said the ledger was clear. She was still working out what to do with that. The shoulder would need 8 weeks. What? Probably 10 to full function, longer to the kind of full function that the work she'd been doing required. That was time she hadn't had in 4 years. Not enforced rest, not the deliberate pause of someone choosing to stop, but actual enforced recovery that the surgeon had been explicit and unambiguous about. 10 weeks was enough time to make a decision that wasn't being made while running. She was tired of running. She hadn't known how tired until she'd had 4 days of not running to compare against it. Hartwell had said, in their second formal session, that the intelligence community had gaps that looked exactly like the gap that had let Rashid Karim spend 14 months in a mountain region building a coordinated militia network that nobody had formally identified until the siege was already happening. He'd said it in the flat, careful language of institutional assessment, but underneath the language was the same thing Mercer had said. The position outside the system had limits that the position inside it didn't, and the position inside had limits that the outside didn't, and there wasn't a clean answer, but there were better and worse versions of the trade. She looked at her bag, at the envelope inside it. She thought about Victor writing the letter 3 weeks before he died. The careful, fully formed handwriting. The choice to tell her the truth he'd been holding and the timing he'd chosen for it. Not while she was still operational, not before the mission, but after. When the work was done. When she could hold it still. She thought about him listening to the satellite feed. The all clear coming through. And then, not long after, the quiet. He had heard it. He had spent 40 years doing exactly what he'd sent her to do, making decisions about who to trust with the hardest problems, watching from whatever distance was available, solving things that the official frameworks couldn't solve, and carrying the costs of all of it in the private accounting that people in his position kept. He had made a difference that could never be fully documented, and that he would never be fully credited for. And she thought he had understood this about his life and had made peace with it, or the closest thing to peace that someone like Viktor Vasilyev was capable of. She thought that she did not want to spend 40 years doing exactly that, not because it wasn't important work, because she'd done it alone for 4 years, and the most useful thing she'd done in that time was the thing she'd done at Fort Raven, where she hadn't been alone, where Mercer had sat down beside her on the ground and asked, "What do you need?" Where Briggs had provided silence at exactly the right moment and covered her when she moved and written a 2-paragraph letter by hand because he didn't know how to say things otherwise. She picked up the facility phone again. She called Hartwell's number, which she'd been given for the formal review sessions. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Rowan." "The position you mentioned," she said. "The identification stage. Before situations become situations. Who do I talk to about that?" A pause. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I want to know if it's a real conversation or a theoretical one." "It's a real conversation." His voice had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way voices shifted when a person was recalibrating what they'd expected a phone call to be. "It would be a significant change from how you've been operating. I'm aware. Inside the system has constraints, reporting structures, oversight. I'm aware of that too." She looked at the window, at the mirror it had become, at her own reflection in it, the sling, the IV, the room behind her that was a room in a facility in a mountain region not unlike the one she'd spent 76 hours inside, operating alone. The constraints might be manageable. The oversight might be useful. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Thank you." She put the phone down. The room was quiet. Evening fully settled, the window a mirror, the facility sounds moving in the hallways outside with the specific rhythms of a place that didn't stop operating because the day did. She thought about Briggs putting in for his 18th year, about Osei in the courtyard, crying without embarrassment, about Park sitting on the ground, about Chen's hand on Kowalski's shoulder, about 93 people standing in the cold counting each other. She thought about Victor, who had been right that it was solvable, and who had heard the confirmation before the end, and who had died knowing the accounting came out the way he'd calculated it would. She put her free hand flat on the bed beside her. She breathed. The shoulder would take 10 weeks. There would be a formal review and a commendation, and a conversation with people Hartwell was going to call, and there would be a decision at the end of it that she hadn't fully made yet, but that had begun to make itself in the direction of something different from what the last 4 years had looked like. Not clean. None of it would be clean. The work wasn't clean. The system wasn't clean. The trade-offs between what could be done inside and outside never resolved into something you could feel entirely right about. Victor had known that for 40 years, and had kept going anyway, and Mercer knew it, and Briggs with his 17th year going on 18th knew it, and she knew it. You kept going anyway. Not because the math worked out perfectly, because there were 94 names in the count, and all of them were still there, and that was not nothing, and it was enough to be the reason. Outside, somewhere in the direction she couldn't see, the mountains held their cold and permanent position above the valley. unchanged by what had happened in the small human spaces between them, indifferent in the way that mountains were, which was not the same as saying it hadn't mattered. It had mattered. It mattered to 94 people who went home. And the greatest measure of a warrior has never been the enemies they've defeated, but the lives they refused to let disappear.